Good morning. Are you feeling excited? Today is a really exciting day. It's exciting because in the last 12 months, Appeon has released an enhanced version of PowerBuilder 2017 with long-term support. In that same 12 months, we have also brought the productivity of PowerBuilder development to C# and the cloud. And we also have a strategy in place to grow the PowerBuilder base, attracting new C# developers to PowerBuilder, as well as a roadmap that's going to put PowerBuilder ahead of the curve, where other development tools will be playing catch up to PowerBuilder. So I want to outline for you what we have to offer to attract new developers to the PowerBuilder development community. We're going to be focused on pushing PowerBuilder 2018 Cloud Edition. The PowerBuilder 2018 Cloud Edition includes the PowerBuilder IDE, which is a commercial IDE for PowerScript as well as C# development, both client-server as well as cloud applications. We also offer a C# migration solution, which consists of commercial tools as well as a C# framework for fast, rapid migration of existing PowerScript-based client-server applications to C# as well as the cloud. We also provide a brand new C# IDE. That's correct. In the past 12 months, we have created a whole new IDE for ASP.NET and C# Cloud App development. This is a free IDE that's included in the PowerBuilder 2018 Cloud Edition. Please note that the ASP.NET development capability is currently scheduled for PowerBuilder 2018 R2. And we have put forward a new C# framework that's free and open source, cloud-centric, powered by the .NET Core. We'll be talking in a minute why the .NET Core is really a game changer. But please note that the framework will be scheduled to be open sourced by PowerBuilder 2018 R2 release. Currently, it's available but not in an open source format. So why is Appeon focusing on C#? These days, when we look at our enterprise customers, it's either C# or Java, and these tend to be the two key camps out there. Well, one of the reasons PowerBuilder from the Sybase days set forward in the direction of .NET. Also, among PowerBuilder customers, we listen to them, and they're telling us that a larger percentage are gravitating towards the .NET platform as well as C# rather than Java. Now, that's not to say that Java does not have a larger market share than C#, but that also includes all those Android developers building mobile apps. Now, one thing that we like about C#, besides that our customers telling us that's where they want us to go, is that Microsoft, starting a few years ago, open sourced the .NET framework. They created a high-performance, cloud-centric version of the .NET framework called the .NET Core, which is actually cross-OS. It can run on Windows, it can run on Linux, and it's open to other application or web servers, such as Kestrel. Now, since Microsoft has done this, over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of new open source projects around C#. And here's a survey that's dated November 1st from HackerRank. And it's essentially measuring the trend or popularity of developers to learn another language beyond what they already know today. And we'll notice that in terms of a second or third or subsequent language for developers to learn, there's more interest around learning C# than there is Java. Now, you'll be able to find a lot of different surveys that say a lot of different things, but the point here is that definitely C# is a strong contender. Now, you may be wondering why we're targeting from an ORM perspective, which is the C# framework. Our C# framework includes various data objects, transaction management capabilities that are really focused to replace some of the popular ORMs that are in use today for .NET or C# application development. Now, the reason we're targeting this is that we see a lot of pain today with, for example, the entity framework. A lot of room for productivity improvements, steep learning curve, And just the framework is a lot more complex than it needs to be. We think there's a much better way to be developing C# cloud apps rather than using the entity framework. So you can go ahead and take a look at the site showcase.appeon.com, which I'm going to load up right now. And here we're looking at the showcase.appeon.com site. This essentially consists of various code samples highlighting the various objects that are provided in our C# framework. And there's metrics on performance as well, so you can benchmark that. Now, we put this site together to outline that the .NET performance of our framework is much better than what historically you may have known from Sybase in the datawindow.net or the pb.net or the .NET WinForms that they had on the market. So that was really our goal, to outline that our performance is on par with the entity framework. But in reality, when we set out to create this benchmark, what we found is that while the C# data store, for example, would retrieve 9,000 something rows in about 112 milliseconds, the same code sample in the entity framework was taking 916 milliseconds. And we thought that didn't make sense because this is all running on the same .NET Core. It's running on the same IS web server. It's the same exact configuration between the two. So we started looking into the code that we wrote. And you can see that here is the entity framework code. Okay, a lot of code. And if you look at the C# data store, it's just a few lines, a lot simpler. Well, anytime you have a lot of complex coding, perhaps your code can be optimized, right? Because it's so complex, there may be a smarter, better way to write it. So we went through and had our engineers rewrite the code. And so after we rewrote the code, we saw the performance wasn't really improved. So we tried again. And we did version 3. Now all of this is getting the same type of data out of the same database table. With entity framework, there's a lot of different ways to write the code. So you'll see that you're getting about 276 milliseconds, a lot improved, but still not as fast as the C# data store. So at this point, we went and got one of our most senior .NET developers to come and work on the project. And that .NET developer came up with entity version 4 of the code. And you'll take a look at the performance, and now it's improved. And just to illustrate the point, our senior .NET developer wrote 2 other versions just to highlight that, the complexity of the entity framework. You can really write things a lot of different ways. And if you're just a typical .NET developer, not the most senior or perhaps even an architect, you may write poor performing code. So a lot of people blame the entity framework, but really it comes down to how you use the framework, and the complexity really does get in the way. So we firmly believe that the framework should be made lightweight and simple, and that was our approach. We also offer a C# model store, which strips away the actual SRD or data window data object, and as a result of stripping that data object away, it's even lighter. Now, when the data object is stripped away, it's no longer visual. So when you're generating your data objects, you'll see that there is a data model actually generated for you, which is equivalent of a data object. But the actual coding that you do is very similar to actually the C# data store. It's just a few lines of code, so it's quite simple. And because the data object is stripped away, you can see that it takes actually less CPU power. It's a lighter weight object with similar performance as the C# data store. So how are we going to approach to grow the PowerBuilder base and attract new developers? Well, the first phase is we need to hang on to the existing customers we have. That's the first phase. There's anywhere between 10 to 20,000 customers worldwide using PowerBuilder today, and we can't begin to grow our community or our customer base if we can't hang on to the existing customers we've already gathered over the years. So we have a strong focus on enhancing client-server development because a lot of our customers do have mission-critical applications, and it is important for them to maintain these applications for the long term. So that's been the focus of PowerBuilder 2017, is really enhancing the client server, and we're going to continue with PowerBuilder 2018 and future releases to enhance client server development. That's really like a prerequisite to move forward in getting users. But really our first phase to bringing new developers to the community actually starts with all of you. All of you PowerBuilder developers, we're looking to get PowerBuilder into new projects. When we say new projects, we mean, for example, taking your existing PowerBuilder application and migrating it to the C# Cloud apps with the PowerBuilder 2018 Cloud Edition, or considering at least doing what's called a hybrid client-server app. So when we say hybrid client-server app, you still have direct connectivity to the database, so in a sense it is a two-tier architecture, but it's taking advantage of some web services or cloud services, for example, through REST web APIs. And so by leveraging PowerBuilder 2018, you can create C# REST web APIs with the productivity of PowerBuilder and expand the functionality of your app. As well as we have a new HTTP and REST client object introduced that'll allow you to consume third-party REST web APIs that may not have been developed with PowerBuilder. So it's all about open standards, the way that we're approaching things. And it starts with you trying to help us to get PowerBuilder's new C# functionalities and cloud features into some sort of a new project. And once we've demonstrated success there within your organization, you may find that there's opportunities to attract new users from within your organizations. And so that would be essentially, there may be a C# developer that's currently using the Entity Framework or maybe Nhibernate, maybe using Visual Studio. At this point, it's not important what IDE they use. This is not an IDE war to say use the PowerBuilder IDE, use Appeon C# IDE, use Visual Studio or whatever. What we're trying to do is replace Nhibernate, replace Entity Framework with our lightweight, super productive, simple approach to doing cloud app development and ORM. So if you can show them that productivity of what the data store, the model mapper provides, these are the various data objects in our framework, we think that you can then get the other developers within your organization interested in seriously evaluating PowerBuilder, which will bring new users. So we're really counting on all of you to help us to bring new projects and new users from within your organization. From that point forward, as we said, we have a strategy in place to put PowerBuilder ahead of the curve, which we'll be talking about in a separate keynote presentation, which focuses on the cloud direction of PowerBuilder. But as we move forward, PowerBuilder and its C# development capability is going to go beyond simply giving you a better ORM. It's actually going to make it simpler, faster, easier to build cloud-native applications. And at that point, PowerBuilder will actually be ahead of the curve, ahead of what a lot of the other development tools are doing today. I know this all sounds abstract. You're going to have to give us a few years to see the result. But I think the next presentation that we'll be doing in the keynote that talks about the cloud direction will give you at least a little gist of where we're heading, and you can see that that's very different than the direction of traditional C# development tools are heading today. And with that, we'll be in a position to go beyond the current customer base, beyond the traditional C# developers, and really attract a whole new generation of cloud-focused application developers. So let me talk about PowerBuilder 2018 for client server. There's a number of features we've added that makes client server development with PowerBuilder really enhanced compared to, for example, if you're on PowerBuilder 12.x or older version. By upgrading to PowerBuilder 2018, you get on a supported version of PowerBuilder that supports the latest versions of Windows, for example, Windows 10, Windows Server 2016. It also gets you on the latest versions of the databases, latest versions of SQL Server, Oracle, SQL Azure. And you get long-term support. That's something that we're introducing starting from PowerBuilder 2017, which continues with the PowerBuilder 2018 release as well. There are certain revisions of these major releases that we will designate for long-term support. And currently, long-term support is tentatively scheduled for PowerBuilder 2018 R3. What that means is you'll get a minimum of 5 years of maintenance and technical support on that long-term support version. And we do this because we have a number of Fortune 500 companies have very massive systems, hundreds of developers using PowerBuilder, and it's not so easy for them to frequently upgrade year after year after year, with the agile speed that we're doing PowerBuilder. Now, another key thing is PowerBuilder 2018 gives you a lot more security than previous versions of PowerBuilder. First and most basic thing, you got to support TLS 1.2 at least. That's the minimum to be secure these days for any sort of encrypted HTTP traffic. And PowerBuilder 2017 and 18 are the only two versions of PowerBuilder that support the TLS 1.2 standard. Older versions do not. They're on 1.1 or less. And we've added a number of encryption libraries into the PowerBuilder. You can do very strong encryption, asymmetric, symmetric. You can do hashing, for example. And so it lets you really secure the data. And also, we've introduced OAuth. This is an open standard, and it's an alternative to basic authentication. So basic authentication would be, simply passing the username and password. OAuth does things through tokens, and what we've introduced is an OAuth client as well as an OAuth server. So both of those are available. The client would be to call a web API that requires you to pass it a token to be authorized. And an OAuth server would be what's on the server side doing that authorization. So you're able to do both with PowerBuilder 2018. Now, PowerBuilder 2018 is web API enabled. So even if you're not looking to move your whole app to the cloud, you can take advantage of putting certain business logic in the cloud so it can readily integrate with other systems, as well as there may be other third-party cloud services that you want to incorporate into your application. And that's very easy to do now with PowerBuilder 2018 because it is Web API enabled. What we've done to Web API enable it is introducing an all-purpose HTTP client. It supports all the various HTTP methods. You can use it to do generic HTTP stuff, but you can also use it to call REST web services as well as passing OAuth tokens when you're doing those REST web service calls. And we've JSON enabled PowerBuilder, so both the data window as well as giving you a generic JSON parser and generator. You can totally manipulate JSON data, turn it into text, turn it back into JSON. It's really a game changer because these days it's very important to be able to interchange data in JSON format. And before PowerBuilder 2017 and earlier releases, you were only limited to XML, which is still used, but a lot more verbose, definitely less popular than JSON for the cloud architecture. And we've also introduced a REST data window. So the data windows that you're creating, of course, you can have them directly talk to the database, be a traditional two-tier data window, but you have the option to have a distributed data window where the data window on the client side is purely a presentation object and it's being powered by a REST web API that's providing it with JSON data. And again, OAuth is supported for the REST data window as well. So if that web API requires OAuth to do the authentication, that's no problem. It's simply one line of coding. That's how easy it is. Now, PowerBuilder 2018 is also PDF enabled. And so what that means is that you're getting a native engine to generate PDFs. There's not a third-party printer driver that is capturing the printer output and printing it to a PDF file. It's natively generating a PDF from within PowerBuilder without anything extra for you to install or purchase. And so what does that mean? That means that instead of using a PDF printer, when you use a native engine, you can comply with ISO standards, and also you can get a number of security features. So for example, you could put a password on a PDF. You could restrict editing, printing, and so on. And that's very important. With PDF is really commonly used, but these days, a lot of people are looking to take advantage of those advanced features, and you'll be able to do that from within your application. We're also modernizing PowerBuilder UI. PowerBuilder is great technology, but the UI looks like it's from 1995 for the applications you build, and that's not fair. You're doing all that work building great business logic, and the apps need to look the form. And so what we're doing is bringing a new look that is themed. So what that means is there'll be various themes that you can apply, and that's codeless. So rather than going through and doing a lot of coding, you're really controlling your application's look and feel through themes, which are very similar to style sheets in the HTML world. And of course, you can customize the themes. You can use the ones that we provide out of the box without modification, or you can create your own. We're also looking to introduce new controls, for example, a ribbon control, or some other things, especially around navigation. And that is something coming in PowerBuilder 2018, but a later revision. At this point, it's tentatively scheduled for R3, but could be as early as R2. And also dockable windows. The dockable window implementation that the Sybase released in 12.6 really leaves much to desired. We don't know many people using it, and to be frank, it's basically half-baked. It's not even a 1.0, but we see a lot of interest in dockable windows. The MDI is great, but it's a metaphor for multitasking from the 90s. And so what we like to do is bring an upgraded, more modernized metaphor for doing that, which we think dockable windows would definitely be one of those modern ways of doing that. And so that's something also we have scheduled for R3. It's massive work to redo that whole implementation as Sybase did to really make it robust. So we're putting the time to do that, and we're confident that what you'll get will not be a repeat of the past dockable windows. So the last thing that we're introducing with PowerBuilder 2018 is you have the Git and SVN native interfaces. In fact, this was introduced in PowerBuilder 2017, but we've continued to enhance it over each of the revisions of the product. And the native interface really solves a lot of issues in the past, such as limited functionality support, performance issues, or reliance on third-party vendors that may not be so reliable. And also we've integrated with the open source Tortoise clients, both for Git and SVN. So that really expands the functionality. Of course, PowerBuilder provides a lot of the common functionalities within the IDE, but you can go beyond that. And also being able to do a diff integration. So there's a number of diff tools out there that will be able to compare the difference between two versions and help you reconcile any conflicts. So there's a number of tools, and it supports basically all of them under the sun pretty much. So when you get the product, you can take a look at that, but we've gotten really positive feedback from customers in 2017, and we've continued to enhance that moving forward. So we talked about client-server development, and as you can see, we do have a strong focus on client-server, but we also got to bring new projects to PowerBuilder, and increasingly we see new projects are either .NET or Java, and in .NET, C# is definitely one of the popular languages, and more importantly, cloud architecture. Client-server projects are traditionally considered legacy. Now, that's not to say there aren't any new client-server projects, but for the most part, a lot of customers are going to cloud. In our other keynote presentation, we'll be talking about the benefits of going to the cloud and why customers are doing this. But for now, the focus of this presentation is really how we're going to grow the developer base. So let's assume C# and cloud is where a lot of new projects are at. And the point here is that with PowerBuilder 2018, all of you are C# cloud developers. If you know any basic C# syntax, you can begin building C# apps with the productivity of PowerBuilder. And even if you don't know C# syntax, learning simply the syntax takes a couple weeks. It's really not difficult. And once you've done that, because you're such expert PowerBuilder developers, and because PowerBuilder is so productive, you'll be able to run circles around the other C# developers that are using, for example, Entity Framework or NHibernate or one of those ORMs to develop their cloud applications. So why is that? Well, first of all, you'll be using the PowerBuilder IDE, so you're familiar with that. You don't need to waste any time getting familiarized with a different IDE. And also, you'll be doing a lot of your development around the C# data store, which for all practical purposes, it's almost identical to the PowerScript data store. And so you're already experts on that, except that you'll be scripting in C# to operate the various properties, events, and functions of the data store. And you can continue to take advantage of embedded SQL if you want to. So that is supported in our C# framework. And wizards are provided to take care of creating sort of the starter code or the skeleton of your project. So if you're creating a REST web API, we have a REST wizard that would generate a lot of that code for you automatically. Also, there's authentication server wizard provided. So if you're doing a REST web API, you definitely want to have security. You want to authenticate who accesses that. Surely you can use username and passwords, but definitely consider using OAuth because tokens are definitely more secure, in our opinion, than simply passing username and passwords back and forth. And we're all about test-driven development so that you're moving towards a more agile development approach. So the idea here is to do a lot of automated testing so that whenever you're making code changes, you can run through your testing cycle in a short amount of time. And so to help you with that, we have integrated one of the popular open source .NET unit test frameworks, and we provided a wizard that makes it very easy. Now, if you want to use a different unit testing framework with your C# apps, you absolutely can. Everything about our approach to C# is following open standards, so you're not excluded from using other things out there. But the point is, out of the box, we've integrated one for you to make your life simple. And we also provide a C# migration solution. So if your organization is looking to take your application out of PowerScript, out of client server, they say, we need to go to C#. When they say they need to go to C#, that's a full-blown rewrite. It's years of work. A lot of these projects fail. It's not a port. Our migration solution is a port, and it's something you can do yourself. And so with that solution in place, you'll be able to execute that C# migration much faster than any other approach that your organization is considering. So let's talk more about the C# migration solution. Our migration solution consists of a data window migration tool that's going to take all your existing data windows and data stores and migrate it to either a C# data store, or we also offer an alternative to the data store called Model Store. And the key difference being that the Model Store has no dependency on the PowerBuilder IDE. You could maintain that in using Visual Studio or even a text editor. Now, if your application is using embedded SQL, a lot of PowerBuilder apps are, it's basically a copy and paste. In our C# framework, we provide a SQL executor object, and you can essentially copy and paste your embedded SQL into those SQL executor objects and execute them without really much modification. So that's practically copy and paste. Data windows are basically migrated automatically. So what's left is porting your PowerScript to C#. Now, why it's a port is not a rewrite, because regardless you use the data store or the model store, it's offering very similar properties, events, and functions as PowerBuilder. So the way you're going to be writing your logic is going to look very similar in C# as it did to PowerScript. So in that sense, it's a port. It's not a rewrite where you have to rethink, re-architect, redesign things. And this is a do-it-yourself port. So this is all provided as tools within PowerBuilder, included in the Cloud Edition at no extra cost. It's not some magical engine where the vendor tells you, we have this great tool, but you know what? I can't give it to you. You need to outsource the project to us. And God knows how many 100 people they put on there at offshore rates and charge you a fortune to do those migrations. So this is a real port. It's do it yourself. And the result coming out of it is pure C# business objects. It's 100% managed code. It's 100% C#, following open standards. That's really important. Everything that we're about these days when it comes down to C# and cloud and the new features going into PowerBuilder is basically focused on using open standards. And that's really important because then you can maintain it in any IDE, for example. You could take advantage of basically any of the popular testing frameworks. You really don't need to worry about will other things work with it? Is there compatible? That's really one of the biggest values of open standards. And it deploys to the .NET code, and that's in line with our mentality of doing things following open standards, but also because we want to give you a cloud-centric solution. Now, that doesn't mean you have to deploy to the cloud. It's not required to run in the cloud, but our choice to standardize on a .NET Core framework rather than the full .NET framework is so that in the future, if you do want to move to the cloud, this is a cloud-centric solution. And that's really important. You want to be future-proof. You don't know how technology changes, how your technical requirements change in the future, and you don't want to go deep on a stack that then you're tied again to something that you have to go through another migration or rewrite. And you can consume your C# business objects via any client. Again, because it's open standards, these objects are going to be using REST web APIs, generating JSON data back out to the client. So you could have a PowerBuilder desktop client consuming your C# business objects. You could create an ASP.NET page to replace the user interface of the PowerBuilder client. Or if you want to use another different native technology, such as UWP, for example, from Microsoft, you could do that. It doesn't matter what the client is. It could even be a mobile app, an iOS app written in Swift, an Android app written in Java. So I talked a lot about migration. I mentioned that this is a port. It's not a rewrite. The C# is going to look very similar to PowerScript. So let me outline that for you. Here, we're looking at some PowerScript, and it's basically creating a data store. It's getting the deorder customer object from the database, passing some parameters, and then retrieving that data into the data store from the database. So that's this example here in PowerScript. I'm sure all of you as Power developers, this is very simple for you. It's a very simple code, but it's just to illustrate the concept. So in C# with the C# data store, the way the code looks is as you see here below. And you can see it's essentially following the same thing as the PowerScript. You're creating a new data store. You're passing the data store object or data window object. And then you execute the retrieve function and you're passing the parameters, and then, you're returning the data store at the end of the function. So you can see that this is a port. You really don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about how to rewrite this. You look at the original PowerScript and you're essentially writing the same thing following a C# syntax. So that's why the complexity, the risk, the effort of migrating to C# with this solution is far less than anything else out there that we have seen. So we talked a lot about our C# framework, but it's not just for migration. The framework provides a lot more than just a C-sharp data store. And it's really a cloud-centric framework that we designed for new development. It makes development of C-sharp cloud apps a snap. And let's talk about what makes this so great. What's the value that this framework delivers? Why should a C-sharp developer even consider using this framework for their next project? Well, it's super productive. It's minimal C-sharp coding. You saw earlier that, when we compared Entity Framework, there was how much code there and how much you're coding, with our solution. Now, you can do embedded SQL, but you don't have to. There is no SQL coding required with this C-sharp framework. And a lot of times when you're using ORMs, if you don't like the SQL it generates, people start hand coding SQL. We provide you an approach to be able to control the generated SQL by the framework through what we call SQL annotations, or essentially tags. And so those SQL annotations are basically going to allow you to control the generated output without having to hand code SQL. Hand coding SQL kills productivity, and so we're really trying to get away from that. We also provide automatic transactions. Entity Framework does that if you're using entities. But what if you have a query? Or what if you do have some SQL that you hand coded? So Entity Framework is not going to be able to track those kind of complex transactions automatically. You're going to have to managing that transaction. With our framework, we provide an object called the model mapper, which can basically handle all the different situations as well as nested models, automatically tracking those transactions. Now, it's also low maintenance. Now, why is it low maintenance? Well, with our solution, we have a strong separation of concerns. Okay, so what that means is, your data object just does what the data object should do. It's not going to, for example, do anything UI related. But we go beyond the entity framework. We're one of the few frameworks that is putting all of the SQL or things related to SQL in the model itself. It's not spread out throughout your application. Okay, and so that's really important. It's not so simple as just the visual and the non-visual separated. That's at a very basic level. It's really about putting everything in the right place so that you minimize redundancy and make the maintenance of your application as well as the extension or extensibility of the application much better. So we call that our data model architecture, putting heavy focus on the data model, trying to centralize all the data related stuff in there and keeping your business logic either in the service or the controllers. And we also take care of generating all the models for you. So there's tools we provide to automatically do that, no matter it's an update model or a query model. Query models are more complex than update models. A lot of solutions we've seen on the market don't take care of generating query models for you automatically. And so that's another productivity benefit of using this framework. We have providing the tools to automatically generate all the models for you. So in terms of performance, our framework is much lighter than a lot of the other things we've seen that are popular today. And so the fact that it's lightweight, that helps the performance. The simplicity helps the performance. The SQL annotations also help the performance. You're not hand coding SQL, so if you're not a strong SQL developer, you don't need to worry that the SQL you've written is not going to perform well. Another very interesting thing about our solution is that we do batch execution. So what happens is when you have, like, for example, a transaction, rather than each line being executed against a database as you're going through your transactions until you get to your commits or rollback, what we do is we wait till the end and we just send everything off in one shot. This batch approach really improves the performance and scalability of this framework. Now, the framework is also designed to be cloud native. Now, that doesn't mean that if you use this framework, your app is automatically a cloud native application. But the point is that there's nothing about the framework that holds you back from achieving a cloud native application. And we'll be talking more about cloud native in the other keynote presentation that focuses on PowerBuilder's future cloud direction, how it's going to put cloud app development with PowerBuilder ahead of the curve, ahead of other tools. But at a high level, the framework is following open standards, 100% managed code using the .NET Core. So, in terms of getting new developers to adopt this framework, it's great that the framework offers these benefits, but we also need to make sure that it's easy to adopt the framework. You could deliver something that has a lot of value, but if it's difficult to adopt, then that might affect, your rate of adoption. So we really focused hard on that, and we made some radical choices with this framework that maybe is unheard of from the Sybase days. The first thing is we've open sourced the framework under an Apache 2.0 license. And so that's been a decision we've internally made, and you'll be able to see the open source version around the R2 timeframe. In R1, we've released the framework not open source yet. It's widely available. That's what a lot of Visual Studio developers go to get packages from. Right in Visual Studio, you could search NuGet, you type in Appeon, and the C# framework comes up, and it's free. So it's open source. There's no purchase or procurement process. People can just start to use it, and the framework is IDE agnostic. So I alluded to that. You don't need to switch from Visual Studio if that's the tool you want to continue using and you're happy with it. At this point, we don't care what IDE you use, and we believe when we go a few years out and we've implemented the cloud native, then developers will start to see that developing with our C# IDE offers advantages, at least for cloud native app development compared to Visual Studio. But for now, our focus is just getting as many people possible to use our C# framework. And the framework is cross OS. So even some customers that are focused on Java, sometimes they're choosing Java because they want to run on a Linux server, not necessarily that they're tightly committed to the Java language. Well, the C# shares a lot of similarities with the Java language. You could say Microsoft learned from Java, quote unquote. And so, from a language perspective, in our opinion, we don't really see much of an advantage or disadvantage of using C# or Java. It's really about the fact that is it cross OS? Is it open source? How big of a community is behind it? And you have that now with the .NET Core framework. And our framework only requires basic C# skills. It doesn't have a steep learning curve like the Entity framework. You don't have to be a super senior developer to be successful with it. Pretty much anybody out there that knows some level of C# can start to build apps that actually perform reasonably well, that is not difficult to maintain, and can put out functionality very quickly. And lastly, simple, simple, simple. And I've been, beating this point up on the head, but that's really important. That's what made PowerBuilder so popular in the 90s. People were building client-server apps, but it wasn't simple. And the 4GLs came and solved that problem. And that's what we're doing. Developing C# apps and cloud apps is not simple, and we're simplifying that. And the framework starts to do that from the ORM perspective. So thank you very much.